Hello everyone, Anthro OG here, and today I'm going to talk about Israel, Palestine, and the nation state. And the reason I'm going to talk about the idea of Israel and Palestine and what's going on within Israel and Palestine under the context of nation state is because I think it's a useful tool to really understand not only the context of what's going on in Israel and Palestine and other places in the Middle East, but other conflict zones around the world. All right. First thing we ought to go over is what is a state and how does that lead to becoming a nation state? So most anthropologists and political scientists agree that to be considered a state, there's specific attributes, right? Like 7 specific attributes that go into it. The first one is that an entity or a person or a group of people controls a specific territory, right? And not only do they control that territory, but they represent it abroad, okay? The next one is usually there's some type of productive farming economy. And again, this could be different, right? There are outliers. I can think of like the Cuesta or Calusa, that they had different types of economies and still had these state organizations. But most have some type of productive farming economy. Usually there's some type of taxation or tribute system. And generally speaking, this is just to get people to participate in the society itself or in the state itself, right? There's also social stratification. Now, most people understand social stratification to mean just rich and poor, and that happens. But there's other ways to be stratified as well, and you can still be a state, right? And so you can be like within clans or within, bureaucratic organizations or this type of situation, right? And this is mostly for bureaucracy purposes to get things done, right? Usually there's some type of imposing public building or public works, right, where people collectively come together and do a thing or build a thing. And this could be through force, or this could be through like a collective will to get stuff done. Usually there's some type of record keeping system. And the record keeping system is more to make sure you have enough stuff, generally speaking, right? Do we have enough wheat to feed, these 20,000 people? And this can lead to writing, but doesn't always lead to writing itself, right? And last, but definitely not least, is there's a monopoly on violence, of all the violence that happens within the territory. Now, the difference between a state organization and a nation state is the authority to have these powers, like the monopoly on the violence and controlling that specific territory. That authority comes from the nation, we the people, the nation state, right? Now, who are we the people? This is where things get tricky, because this is, in my opinion, something that's always contested, something that's always being negotiated, if you will, right? Think about the United States. Who were we the people in the United States at the beginning of U.S. history? You got it. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, land-holding, straight dudes. Is that still the same? No, it's a little bit different now, right? And how did it become different? Well, we could talk about the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, right? We can talk about different things that we experience collectively. And this can be anything from famine, or like the Great Depression, to war. Think about pre and post World War I or pre and post World War II, and the ideas of what it meant to be American. It can also be catastrophes like big hurricanes or earthquakes, or think about 9/11. I remember the day before and the day after 9/11, 2 totally different ideas of what it meant to be American, what it meant to be patriotic, right? Or even think about every time we have an election. Every 4 years, there's a donkey and there's an elephant telling you what it means to be American. And the one side's saying, if you do this, then this is real America. And the other side's like, no, this is the real America. So this is something that's always being contested, always being molded and shaped and experienced, right? Now, what about in the Middle East? Well, interesting thing about the Middle East is the nation states in the Middle East, generally speaking, are relatively new. Most of them were formed post-World War I. Right? Think about Iraq, for example, right? Around 1918, Western powers got together and they're like, ooh, look, there's a bunch of oil here. You guys are Iraqi now. And England, you kind of just take control of them, right? And is that saying that there weren't people in Iraq beforehand, or what we now consider Iraq beforehand? Of course not. There's been people in the Middle East for as long as there's been people, right? But in 1918, they found out they were Iraqi. And so when we turn the TV on today and you turn on the news of whatever channel and you see Arabs with Kalashnikovs figuring out what it means to be Iraqi, it's easy to judge and assume, hey, well, why can't you guys just get your stuff together, right? But what was the United States doing 100 years after its inception, right? 1776, 1876, around that time, we were in a civil war, weren't we? Figuring out what it means to be American. A bloody, destructive civil war. I would argue more destructive than anything that's happened in the Middle East, maybe ever. or maybe since Genghis Khan and the Mongols went down, right? And so it's easy to judge, but I would caution to withhold judgment and look in the mirror a little bit for other nation states. And this isn't unique to Iraq and the Middle East at all, right? In fact, I would argue that every nation and every nation state around the world has a history in strife and violence and good and bad things, right? Like, again, the United States, right? It's good argument can be made that the United States was built off of the backs of a Native American genocide, of 400 years of slavery, in conjunction with this amazing living document that we call the Constitution that can be amended, the Declaration of Independence, rugged individualism, ideas of freedom and religious freedom and personal freedom, etc. Right? And again, every nation around the world, I would argue, has these same qualities. Think about Germany. That's an easy one, right? Post-World War II Germany is relatively easy to figure out why it's done some of the things it's done. But what about a country like Italy or Brazil or Mexico or Venezuela? Right? Or China, for that matter, right? Pre-Mao and post-Mao China are two totally different ideas, aren't they? And they're still figuring out what it means to be Chinese. Think about the Uyghur population, right? Or the Taiwanese population. Now, what does this have to do with Israel and Palestine? Well, Palestine is a relatively new entity as well, right? I think it's like 1921, if I'm not mistaken, post-World War I, right? And it was kind of given into British control. Now, is this saying that Palestinians weren't there before 1921? Of course not. Of course they were there. They were there. Arabs were there. Muslims, Christians, Jews, we're all there, right? And all of a sudden, okay, you guys are Palestinian, right? What about Israeli or Israel? Israel was later, like 1948, right? I think, yeah, late 40s. So it's relatively new as well. And right now they're kind of figuring out what it means to be Israeli and kind of figuring out what it means to be Palestinian. And they're going to have to live with the consequences of their decisions for the rest of the existence of those entities or those states, right? Those nation states. And this is not to absolve anybody from any type of guilt of the terrible things that are happening there. In fact, the opposite, right? No, I don't think anyone or very few people that were taken hostage on that October day had anything to do with the right-wing nationalist government of Israel, right? They were just people, most of whom were at a friggin' dance party at a music festival, right? Innocent people, innocent Israelis. And the same can be said for the people who are dying right now in Palestine, the overwhelming majority of which have nothing to do with Hamas. It's like the old proverb goes, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And so I give this idea or this paradigm or this lens to look at this situation because it's useful and because it can be extrapolated onto other situations as well. What's going on in Ukraine has everything to do with national identity. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? What does it mean to be Russian? Right? And different peoples have different ideas of what that means, right? You can look at the Congo, you can look at Sudan and South Sudan and how that broke off. I mean, think about what's going on with the Kurds, largest ethnic group in the world without a nation state of their own, right? Kurdistan doesn't exist. And so I hope this helps kind of look at the context of what's going on around the globe, and thanks for listening. Have a good one.